Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you happen to be. Today we are at Organizing in the Time of COVID. Staying in Mexico, you may have heard Sylvia Rivero talking about industrial agriculture and the connection with the deforestation that industrial agriculture is so intimately associated with. Today, I have two really remarkable people who very kindly agreed to join us to talk about really uh, the effect and impact of COVID and the struggles of indigenous people whose land has been gradually being taken away. We have two guests. One is Raquel Gutiérrez Aguilar, researcher and professor of sociology at the Instituto de Ciencias Social y Humanidades, the Autonomous University of Puebla. I just hope my Spanish is correct there. She has done research about indigenous movements in Latin America, and more recently about the feminist struggles. And I think that's a really important dimension that we often don't see in relation to the struggles of indigenous people. She's been involved deeply in these struggles and writes and thinks about it. She has published a book, Rhythms of the Pachacuti, Indigenous Uprising and State Power in Bolivia, which was published by Duke University Press in 2014. Our second guest who will also be involved is John Holloway, who is a lawyer, a Marxist-oriented sociologist and philosopher, whose work is closely associated with the Zapatista movement in Mexico, where he's made his home since 1991. He's the author of numerous and really, really interesting books, including Changing the World Without Taking Power, Crack Capitalism, With the Crisis of Capital, In, Against, and Beyond Capitalism, and so on. If you've not been introduced to John Holloway before, I think this is a really good opportunity to open our discussions. So wanting to wish you all a very warm welcome, John and Raquel. Thank you for joining us today.
No, thank you very much, Firoz, for the invitation. It's lovely to be there with you.
Well,
yes, Firoz. Hello, and thank you very much. And it's a very good effort to keep us alive in this dramatic situation.
Indeed, indeed, it is a dramatic situation. And a real pleasure to meet you, Raquel, at long last. And John, well, we met you. We got together with you in Puebla when we were visiting Mexico just a few weeks ago. And I wish we'd stayed on longer because then we wouldn't have been allowed to come back. But there we are. What I'd like to maybe perhaps start with, there have been various kinds of headlines on this whole issue of the struggle of indigenous people and the impact of COVID. And this particular headline from the National Observer, COVID-19 crisis tells the world what indigenous people have been saying for thousands of years. Well, what have they been saying to us for thousands of years, Raquel?
Well, they've been saying a lot of things, but mainly what I would like to point here is that what, in my opinion, indigenous peoples have done in many years. I study indigenous peoples from Latin America, so the great change in Latin America came at the moment of colonization, of Spanish colonizations in most part of the from Mexico to the south, and from Portuguese colonization in Brazil. And in that moment, what was very, very important was that the indigenous people try all the time to maintain some material wealth under their own control. And they dealt and they rebelled once and again to the colonization process to maintain some land, to maintain and keep some water under that they could manage, that they could decide how to use, and they maintained the forest, and then because they were deeply concerned on maintaining life, collective life, and by collective life, individual life, not the other way around. They were trying to maintain collective life of the tiny pueblos, it's the word we used here in Latin America, and people were included in that. I mean, singular people were included in that pueblos, and they all had a lot of things to do that kind of designed communitarian weaving. That's the way we say it. We don't say community, we say communitarian weaving, because it's not something that it's like a fossil from the past that just goes on as progressist people and capitalist progressist people think that should be modernized or bettered by some extra some heteronymous ways of thinking, let's say. The other way around, exactly. It's an everyday thing of making links alive, of having the links between them to keep the water, to keep the forest, to use the land, to organize everyday life, etc. Well, that's, I think, that's the most important thing I have learned from a lot of research and work and participation in the indigenous movements. What we always say that indigenous peoples resist. And we say resist because we cannot recognize until now, I mean, we modern people that are urban, etc., the importance of having the chance to have the life ongoing. And they learned that experience very difficultly and very sadly when the process of colonization started with another very big pandemic, the Viruela pandemic. I don't know how to translate Viruela, John, perhaps you know.
Smallpox, I think.
Okay. So, in most modern times, what I mean, I'm saying I'm putting this long idea, this big idea that we can go afterwards thinking about it. But if we think in a shorter period of time, let's say all this period that is being called neoliberalism, and that perhaps it's cracking now because merchandises cannot circulate as far and capital cannot go circulating as fast as they were putting it to do. There was something that which was very interesting in all the movements that have taken place in defense of life, in defense of water and life, in defense of land and life. Because we have had in Latin America in the last, let's say, 20 years, 25 years, a lot of uprisings, a lot of mobilizations, a lot of actions in defense of water, of forest, of land, of life. And they mixed all these words. A lot of movements tried. And they say one thing that it's very interesting. Money is not worth for eating. You cannot eat it. So we have to have water, we have to have land, we have to have food, we have to have some energy to stay alive. So let's have it. But having it it's a matter of organizing among ourselves and struggling all the time to those who want to take it away of us. So that's something I've learned from the indigenous movement. And I think that in these days that are so dramatic, so difficult for the cities, for a lot of people, we really have to see what they have been saying. I don't know if in thousands of years, but at least 500 years, they have said that, and they have practiced that. So there are lots of things to learn in that. I would start that way.
But they have also been the victims, well, the survivors of an assault by colonialism, by capitalism, in appropriating their land, in destroying that land.
Yeah.
And now we're faced in a situation where there is a pandemic of the COVID coronavirus, new coronavirus. What kind of impact is that going to have on these communities, these organized networks, these complex inter-associations of indigenous people?
Well, I mean, I can say, but I can kind of imagine some of those. But the first thing is that the most dangerous and stressful part of the problem lies in cities, and we are looking at it. I mean, let's see New York. Sometimes they say this is the capital of the world because of all the things that is concentrated, that because of all the energy it needs to go around, and what is going on in New York. So there's a problem about scale, and the indigenous people, they're not only rural, but they are mainly rural. And they don't lose, that's very interesting too and very important too, they don't lose their links with the migrant ones that settled in cities, or for some period of years, they tried not to lose that link. So a lot of cities or peri-urban parts of the cities in Latin America are going to be able to have food in the months to come because of what is going to be produced in rural areas and manage to get to there. But that's going to happen if the destruction process stops or ralentizes at least a while, un poco. I cannot say it. So I think that they are more secure than us now. We don't have to see them as victims. I mean, the victims of this big thing is all humanity, let's say. I mean, we are all in danger. But the victim language, as feminists say, it's not very useful. What are we going to do? How are we going to deal with this thing? And the most important thing is going to be, how are we going to reorganize afterwards? And who has some knowledge to face all these things? Of course, indigenous peoples, and of course, women. That's kind of a point of view. I really didn't answer very accurately what you said, but I could say that. Let's go on, John, because it's for me to speak in English. No, I'm making the effort of translating.
No, I know. I appreciate that. Sorry that my Spanish is non-existent. John, you want to back up?
Yeah, I'm very much in agreement with Raquel. I mean, I don't think we have differences on these points at all. I suppose I'm a little bit hesitant. I think this is really what was coming out in what she was saying about, let's not just think of the communities in the countryside, let us think also of the cities. And I'm always slightly hesitant about talking about indigenous movements in the third person. I think we have to think of ourselves. And when you ask, well, what are they saying and what have they been saying for thousands of years? In a sense, that only makes sense if we say at the same time, what are we listening to? What are we hearing? Why didn't we hear it for thousands of years or hundreds of years? And why is it that we're hearing it now? And I think that's really important. I think it's really important to bring out how the coronavirus, the COVID-19, is having this enormous exposure effect or effect of defetishizing. It's really opening up our minds. I mean, we may, obviously it's a miserable situation, but at the same time, it's making us think, it's making us question things that we haven't questioned before. No, you mentioned just before we started that you're now reaching, 20,000 listeners, which is just extraordinary. No, but that, I think, is a reflection of the fact that people are thinking, how did this disaster come about? And what does it mean in terms of how we understand the possible future of the world? And there, of course, we look to the indigenous tradition. We look to the indigenous tradition partly because the indigenous movements in the last 20, 30 years almost, especially since the Zapatista uprising at the beginning of 1994, have been extraordinarily articulate in their criticism of capitalism and in their criticism of the way in which capitalism relates to nature. But the question is also, what are we hearing? No, what are we hearing? What are we learning about the way in which capitalism is destroying the preconditions of human existence? And how do we take that up? How do we who live in cities, how do we who aren't indigenous in the usual sense, though I suppose we all come from somewhere, how do we take that up and think about it? And how can we, if we think of this kind of enormous exposure effect, this enormous defetishizing effect of the present crisis, how do we pick that up and run with it, as it were? No, I mean, suddenly everybody is thinking, well, not everybody, but I think an awful lot of people are saying, well, yeah, I mean, if we're in this terrible situation, if we're locked up in our homes, then this is because of the way in which humans have been destroying other forms of life, especially over the last 30, 40 years, but really since the origins of capitalism. If we're in this situation because of that destruction, what does that mean in terms of how we come out of it? We can't just think in terms of going back to the normality of last year. What we have to learn is how we change things, how we change this relation between humans and nature. And there, of course, we look to the indigenous traditions and we understand. They help us to understand. They help us to understand things. They help us to understand, as Raquel said, in terms of community weaving, in terms of how we go weaving our lives, our relations with other people, but not just our relations with other people, as well our relations with animals, insects, plants, other forms of life. So I think your question, Firoz, is terrific. And on the other hand, I'm slightly worried about a kind of projection, a kind of connection. Well, Mexico, indigenous movements, there's the answer. And it isn't like that. I mean, Mexico is, of course, as you know very well, a land of big cities. Mexico City is one of the biggest in the world. It's a land of cities where We live, Raquel and I both live in the city of Puebla, which listeners may or may never heard of, but has, 2 million odd people. Not necessarily odd people, some of them odd people. But, and the question is, yes, how do we come out of this terrible experience in a way that rethinks or reposes this relation with our natural environment? No?
Well, perhaps we get a little bit more specific about how is it? In what way does COVID-19 help us to understand more clearly, to listen more carefully, as you put it, to the very destructive nature of capitalism, especially in the peripheries? So I mean, take for example, Raquel, you raised the issue of the way in which women are organizing around that. So what is COVID telling us about that? What is it revealing for us that we weren't listening to before, we weren't aware of before?
Look, there are three things that I think that this all the situation is putting in the center, and we women, the feminist movements and the struggles of many different women, feminists or not feminists, have been putting on the table. That was about the contradiction between capital and life, between capital and labor, but between capital and life. And that's an issue that feminism has been discussing deeply in the last decade, but quickly and very, very wisely in the last 5 years, let's say. So the importance of the reproduction labor, the reproduction that supports everyday life on capital basis, but not only on capital basis, because of this not recognition or not, I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but there's not recognition of all the things that are produced and done in households to support life every day. And now that is absolutely visible. And the people that are having really dramatic everyday life today are mothers that take care of their kids, that have to do the homeschooling, and that have to do their office work, and that have to support in a different way with all these difficulties of getting food and going out, then cleaning, then doing all the things that we have been pushed to do, because we have been pushed to do this because of this coronavirus, because of the way we are organized. And we feminists have been saying that we had to put the reproduction of life in the center, and that we have to deal with all the patriarchal capitalism that has been developing a new recolonization of all the world, deepening the tendencies in the last 50 years, let's say. So the importance of the trabajo de cuidados, the care work, that now it's central. It's central because who are taking care of kids and who are taking care of older people that have to be confined in a more rigorous way, let's say. The other thing is that we have been putting a very deep item, mainly the feminist struggle from Argentina, but not only, on the rejection of debt. The rejection of debt was another point that was very, very important because of all this money that is circulating in the world, that it's what, and what does it, what is it useful for? Just to organize our subjection. So we in the feminist movement were discussing a lot about how we had to organize ourselves to reject that. And we were actually doing it, as was doing the most important struggle, feminist struggle, that was the Chilean one in this year. In this the precise 6 months before this COVID situation. So putting reproduction of life and care work in the center, and rejecting debt, and putting increases and or trying to go beyond, as John always says, to go beyond the way we get ensembled by capitalists, and trying to very quickly organize another way, some other ways to resonate between each others, to more or less weave ourselves with the others, was something that was being done in Latin America in a very, very deep sense. And there were very interesting discussions. And now this COVID seems to put it to stop at that, all that discussion and all that struggle, and puts them in this situation. And it's very difficult to do that. And that's why we feel that in a one sense, I'm not in this conspiranoic thing, but the effect that it has had, that this situation of COVID-19 has had in our organization processes, it's really making them difficult. It's really making them, we don't know how to do, as states came to the center of the scene, and we start looking all these military men, these men with guns, trying to or put some order in the cities and all that. We are really shocked, and we are discussing a lot by the means we can have now. And we say that we will have to reassume the struggle as soon. We are thinking now, and we are discussing, and we are trying to understand, etc. But we have to make it really, really, really a deep struggle when we can go to the street again, and we can have this massive assemblies that we were having in a lot of countries, because the world, we have to struggle for it. We have to struggle for life now, and that means changing the way we are understanding things. And we need really to operate in the inversion of the vocabulary. The words seem not to be useful now, because, for example, all this, as I was telling in the beginning, all this discussion between economy or life, how can we deal with it? How can we kind of reorganize that, not to be antagonic? That's a problem. And I agree with John when he says that all this fetishizing movement, but we have to push esta desfetichización. How
the defetishization? Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah. But give me an idea of what's actually going on. I assume, like most countries, the government has said lockdown, social distancing, washing hands being the sort of elements of that. Is that what is happening in Mexico?
Yes and no. I think yes, the government's line is very much please stay at home. stay at home, stay at home. But it's a please stay at home. And an awful lot of people, of course, cannot stay at home. I mean, in that sense, it's probably different from the richer countries. Just a huge part of the population live from day to day. And it's very difficult for them simply to stay at home. They live by going out and working. They live by going out and selling things. So in that situation, that sense, it's different. I think it's very much please stay at home, but it's not like other countries where you have, if you go out, at least the experience I have, it's not that you're going to be confronted by the police necessarily and just justify what you're doing. In that sense, I think it's also it's slightly different in the sense that I feel we're still waiting. The virus hasn't arrived here yet on anything like the scale that it has arrived in the United States or Britain or Italy or France. I mean, we're talking of what I think a total of, I'm not sure, about 500 deaths. It's certainly nothing like 1,000 a day, nothing at all. It may well be in a week or in 2 weeks' time, or in 3 weeks' time. It may well be like that. But at the moment, we're in a kind of, a kind of waiting period where it's still not clear how serious the health disaster is going to be. And it's still not clear, though it's becoming increasingly clear, I suppose, it's just how strong the economic catastrophe is going to be. Everything points to a that Mexico economically will perhaps be one of the worst hit places. But we're not quite there yet.
Talking about that, in Mexico, I compare with some other Latin American countries. And for example, in Guatemala, in Bolivia, or in Honduras, and some other places, governments, in my opinion, have taken advantage of this crisis for two things. To again put the military on the streets to control people, one. And the second is to change a lot of laws. In many countries, perhaps some other people have told you in your interviews, Feroz, how many laws have been changing. For example, in Guatemala, they passed the transgenic law, that has been halted by the communitarian struggle before, and they just pass it. Now that's a more difficult situation, etc. And that contrasts with Mexico, in my opinion, because in here, as we have these war on drugs since the year 2006, our men are already in the streets, and we are used to seeing our men in the streets all the time, and we see them now too. They don't deal with movement control yet, but they haven't not needed to do that because they have done it before.
Right.
And we are in a very strange situation too, because all the bad laws that have to be passed, all the bills that have to be imposed, have been imposed too in the years before. And so now we have a very strange government that is trying to deal with these. It's a very capitalistic and very authoritarian government, but it is engaged, in my opinion, in some kind of circulación de élite, John.
Circulation of elites.
Yes, a circulation of elites. Yeah. and that makes Mexico this some kind of thing that seems to be a discordant note in all the saying the governments are singing. But there's another point, that it's what is the popular in Mexico. This, what is used to call, that it's usually called informal economy. It's a very, very, very big popular sector that sells things, that produces things, that brings services from here to there and all that. And they have a very, very big experience to dealing, to negotiating with government and to not obeying. I would explain it like that. The Mexican popular sector is a disobedient one, and it's a disobedient one now too. But it's not a disobedience that it's a kind of absurd disobedience. They calculate. They know very well to calculate among what have they to do and to risk themselves to get something, and how they protect some others, and all that mainly in the marketplaces. I think that is active now, that it's all those knowledge is activated. Perhaps I have an optimistic view of what is going to happen in Mexico, but I really think that we are going to deal it because of this popular sector that does not obey, but innovates, but deals with, but kind of knows how to organize, and well, I don't know what's going to happen. And that's tiring here, because we locked in our houses. We were called to locked in our houses very early. So we don't see all the drama like in Europe or in the United States. Right. And we have already it's the fifth week that we have. I mean, we, the ones that can, are locked up. It's the fifth week with no school. Right. So perhaps we don't have such a big amount of disease. I don't know.
Yeah, John, you were wanting to say something, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. What Raquel says about the kind of culture of disobedience and resistance. But we're also in a situation where we just don't know. We just don't know what's going to happen in terms of the virus itself. No? I mean, if in 3 weeks' time we find that 1,000 people are dying per day, then I think that will have a very different impact. But that's very hard to predict. Also, we just don't know yet how hard the economy is going to be hit. I mean, just in terms of how hard people are going to find it to survive from one day to the next. I mean, it's already there. There's already a big impact, but that can grow enormously in the next month or so. So we are in that kind of situation of waiting, I think. Well, no, yeah, of suspense.
Yeah. I mean, I find it really quite interesting in terms of what you're describing in terms of the government's response. Because in Kenya, for example, and it's happened in Ghana, it's happening in South Africa, it's happening in a number of African countries. It's happened in India, indeed. And that is that the state has used this opportunity not just to lock down, but to militarize and securitize the streets. And as a result, what one gets the impression of is that social distancing is almost interpreted as protecting the elite from the riffraff, diseased populations. So it's really interesting that is not being the policy. But I want to pick up this issue about being disobedient and lacking necessarily credibility of the state itself. I mean, that has been a central issue amongst in Chiapas amongst the Zapatistas, who always had their own way of doing it. John, can you give us some idea of how they are responding? How are they organizing in their situation in terms of dealing with the COVID crisis?
In detail, I don't really know. I mean, Raquel may know more than I do, but certainly it was striking that very early on, already 3 or 4 weeks ago, or maybe more, they came out with a very clear statement saying, look, we have to take this seriously. This is a serious problem. We have to isolate ourselves. All our meetings are cancelled. They have been organizing things through the internet. No, they've been organizing, was it a week of participation through artistic projects, I think. In terms of how they are doing it in detail in the communities, I just don't know. Possibly Raquel knows more about that.
Not really. Not really. I mean, I know what John knows because I think it was around March the 20th when they decided to close their caracoles and all their area of influence. And they said exactly what John said. Don't come. We are going to close our spaces. We are going to reorganize in here. We are going to wait to see what happens. And what they are trying to do is to maintain some level of voice and of teleorganization. Last week they had this thing about, for example, Samir Flores. Samir is a man from Morelos, that is a state nearby Puebla in the center of Mexico, that was killed more than a year ago, and he was a very important communitarian leader that had a very, very important work dealing against a big project, this mega project, and he was killed. And then, they made some festival to remember him, and they are organizing now some conferences of people near them are organizing some activities through the internet and etc. But we don't know exactly what's going on inside them. And what I think I just imagine it's that they are preparing they are stocking their food, they are taking care of their seeds, they are cleaning their water channels, they are cleaning their dwells. I mean, they are doing what it has to be done, that it's take care of what it's going to sustain us in very difficult times, I think. But we're not saying
it's also quite likely that they're preparing some sort of coming out again after the immediate crisis is over. I mean, they've just have surprised us so many times with their originality and the way they suddenly come out with a new project or a new line. So I would think they're probably working on that as well. One thing I would like to come back to is something that Raquel was emphasizing, the question of the reproduction of life and the idea of capital against life. I think now the thinking in traditional Marxist terms, in terms of the capital against labor, has become questioned, just because labor, if we understand it as capitalist labor, is obviously what produces capital. So that I think there has been a move, not just in the feminist movement, but also more, I would say more widely, to thinking of the antagonism in terms of capital against humanity or capital against life. And I think that precisely with this crisis, with this coronavirus crisis, that is actually what leaps to the front. No, we are now talking about capital against life. No, in a way that has been never been so clear. No, I mean, in Britain you have the Extinction, the movement, the Extinction Rebellion. No, but I think that and then I suppose we've been saying, or people have been saying for a long time, well, if capitalism continues to exist, it's going to lead us to the complete annihilation of humanity. But I think what we're now in is what is possibly the first phase of our own extinction. No, that really we can't just think, oh, in the future things are going to be dreadful. We're now in the situation where we feel what could turn out to be the first of a whole series of waves of extinction. No, it seems to me that the experts are talking about this as being the first of what is quite likely to be a series of pandemics. No, and now more than ever, we have to say, certainly there are other forms of reproduction of life. Certainly, Raquel is right to emphasize the importance of work at home, the work of women in caring for children, etc. But we live in a society in which the reproduction of life is mediated basically through capital, basically through the commodity, and this is so clear in this moment that this form of the reproduction of life has failed. I mean, it is really just the clearest expression possible of the failure of the capitalist reproduction of life. No. So now, really more than ever, we have to take up the question of saying, well, there are other ways of doing it. Yeah, and there, yes, the whole tradition of the feminist movement is very important. The tradition of eco-socialism, eco-feminism, etc. But we have to say, look, what we are living through is the failure of capitalism. How do we pick up on that? How do we run out of the crisis with that? No. How do we say we cannot go back to the normality, because normality is a normality of destruction? No?
But yes, I would like to add something.
Sure.
Just emphasize again. Let's not go back to normality. Normality was the problem, as the Chileans say, as the feminists are saying, as a lot of people say. That was the problem. Normality was the problem. And we have an alteration of normality, that it's really a crack in normality. So let's try to imagine and talk and make lots of dialogues about how to deal with another kind of normality, in which we all know what are we going to eat, what water we are going to drink, what forests we are going to go around and to enjoy, and try to recognize that the ones that have been looking for that have been people that has been criminalized, that has been killed, and that people is the one that we are going to owe our life, our future life, if there is life, we are going to owe it to them. I mean, to our mothers, but to them that have, because we have to restart, let's say, I mean, and organizing our linkings and our weavings in another way around, thinking, rejecting all the things that have brought us to this horrible situation.
I think
I think it's
right, both of you. That
kind of I have to go on.
We're entering a situation of contestation between how capital will want to reconstruct life or living, the way of exploiting, and the potential that COVID has now opened up of another contestation, another way of living. And I think this is what Arundhati Roy points out. We're at a portal with a choice on that. But to me, the key issue is it's one thing for intellectuals like ourselves to talk about capital and of COVID being a product of capital. But the question is, how do you make this a popular, that people actually speak in those terms or understand it in those terms, rather than just a natural disaster, which is often what is being presented. And there, that raises the problem, the big question: how do you organize in the time of COVID? Because this is precisely the time when we need to be organizing, we need to be connecting, we need to be opening up and listening, as you said, John, to how people are giving expression to their realities.
Yeah, I think I mean, there is, yeah, of course, we all fall into the language of, yes, the kind of small intellectual left group or whatever. But I actually think that's what's interesting at the moment is that the connection between capitalism and coronavirus, the connection between the coronavirus and the capitalist destruction of nature over the last 30, 40 years in particular is actually becoming mainstream. Not that everybody is talking about it, but it's something that's certainly appearing in the newspapers more and more. You know, it's clear more and more people. Of course, it's not coming out in government statements, but I think more and more people are saying, look, there's something basically wrong here. We know that there's a link between the virus and the way in which wild animals have been treated. We know that there's something here about the way in which markets, food markets are organized. We know it's got something to do with the destruction of the habitats of animals. We know that it's got something to do with the loss of biodiversity. So I think it has become, in a way, when I say, look, we really have to see this as a moment of exposure, I think that this is something that is entering more and more into the mainstream, that more and more this link is being made. Of course, it's not enough. Of course, it's not enough, but that perception seems to me is spreading.
Okay, so I mean, we're coming up to nearly an hour of our discussions. Absolutely fascinating issues being raised. Perhaps some last words from each of you. Raquel, issues that you would like to table, things that we need to reflect on.
Well, I insist on this. I insist on things that we have to be thinking about in these days. In one level, for example, for students and all that, the relation between capitalism and patriarchy and colonization. That's a big issue to understand, to think about it, intertwined, linked, and because in all the other attempts, a lot of organizing attempts, we have been thinking about one thing or one other, etc. But the immediate link of patriarchy and capitalism and colonization is something that we have to deal with, and we have to. I would like that people started or go deeper thinking about it and talking about it and understanding it. And the other thing that I think it's going to be very important for for the time to come when we have to do the struggle with that, it's three things. Rethinking how we make this, how we garantizamos la vida. John.
How we guarantee life, how we
guarantee life. How we guarantee life. How we deal with debt, because we have to reject debt. And we need another language, because the language, I'm really thinking about that. The language we are talking about even now, when we talk about economic, for example, when the mainstream talks about that we have to go back and we have to reestablish the economic running and et cetera, what are they saying? That they want to go even deeper in what has been destructing us. So we really have to devaluate their language at the same moment that we kind of go building our own language to mean what we want.
Yeah.
That's what I would say. I'm dealing with that. I'm trying to organize with tiny groups, big groups, students, etc., to do that. And well, something will come.
Great. John?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yes, I'm taking up the last point in particular. I think that what is really pushed in our face by this crisis is the fact that we're talking about the reproduction of life. We're talking about the way in which the present system threatens the reproduction of life. No. And that it can't, obviously, we can't just go on like that. That to reproduce life through turning everything into a commodity to be bought and sold is actually destroying the conditions of human life. I think we have to take seriously now, not just the idea of extinction in the future, maybe in 100 years' time. We really have to take seriously the idea that this may well be the first wave which will come back, which perhaps will come back increasingly severely, the first wave of our own extinction. And we have to stop that. We have to stop. I suppose, I'm thinking in terms of my children or the grandchild I've just had. I suppose it was always a tendency in some way to make an abstraction between thinking about the future and possible annihilation and their lives. And now when you see what this pandemic means and what it means in terms of locking us up, in terms of people's fear, in terms of isolation, in terms of stopping people from hugging and kissing, then you think, wow, no, this is actually much closer than we had realized before. We really have to think of it as urgent, as something that's, here, now.
Indeed, yes. And it becomes even more poignant when you think about the next generations. Yeah. Indeed. Well, I want to thank both of you. I think we could have spent the rest of this afternoon and evening, if not tomorrow morning, discussing this further. But it has been a really interesting discussion, and I think opened up dimensions and perspectives that I think add to the many issues that others have raised in the interviews that we've done. So I'd really like to thank you both for taking time to participate in this show, and really thank you for your contributions. it's been great to have you on the show. I'm only sorry we can't be there physically and expressing our love by putting our arms around you both. Yeah.
Thank you, Firoz. This is
When we will do it.
yes. We're waiting for you and Molly.
Here.
We're waiting for you and Molly to come back to Puebla, and then
Yeah.
we will do it properly.
We will do it properly. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Please
All right.
take care of yourselves. Yeah. A luta continua.
Eso.
Okay. Okay, so.
So how we go out?
Yeah.
Leave the studio. All right.
You out at the moment. I'll say goodbye to the watchers.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
That was a remarkable discussion with Raquel Gutiérrez Aguilar and John Holloway. Thank you so much for joining us on the show today. We've had two shows today, and looks like with the enthusiasm that's being expressed, we may continue with 2 shows a day. I hope you're keeping safe. I hope you're keeping well. And thank you for joining us on this show. This is Firoz Manji from Daraja Press signing off.